The summer heat was settling heavily over Maplewood, a quiet suburban neighborhood that usually lived without much fuss. The manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and identical mailboxes gave off an impression of harmony and order. But underneath that carefully maintained surface, tension was brewing. Independence Day was approaching, and for the families of Maplewood, fireworks had always been more than just a tradition. They were the highlight of the year, the one night when the whole community came together, children with sparklers, parents with folding chairs, and grandparents watching the sky light up with bursts of red, blue, and gold. It was something that made their little neighborhood feel alive. But this year, the Homeowners Association had something else in mind. 2 weeks before the 4th of July, a notice was slid into every resident's mailbox. Printed neatly on the HOA's official letterhead, the message was short and stern. Effective immediately, the use or display of fireworks within the Maplewood community is strictly prohibited. Violators will be fined $500 per incident. The neighborhood buzzed with disbelief. For years, fireworks had been part of the fabric of Maplewood. Families would host barbecues in their driveways, teenagers would run around with glow sticks, and the cul-de-sacs became gathering spots filled with laughter. To take that away felt like ripping out the heart of their traditions. The first to react was Daniel Rivera, a 38-year-old father of two who had lived in Maplewood for nearly a decade. Daniel wasn't the kind of person who sought out conflict, but the ban struck a nerve. His kids, Maya and Lucas, had been looking forward to the holiday for months. They had already picked out sparklers and small firecrackers from the store. When Daniel read the notice out loud at dinner, Maya's face crumpled. "No fireworks, but it's the 4th of July, that's not fair." Lucas slammed his fork against the table in frustration. Daniel's wife, Sophia, gave him a look that said everything. He couldn't let this stand. Word spread quickly. Neighbors stopped each other in driveways and on sidewalks, shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Thompson fight without risking everything. Late one evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with Sophia. The glow from the overhead lamp cast long shadows and the table was littered with notes and flyers. Sophia poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "You're carrying a lot on your shoulders," she said softly. "I know," Daniel admitted, rubbing his temples. "But if we don't stand up now, what's next? No barbecues, no decorations, they'll just keep tightening the rules until this place doesn't feel like home anymore." Sophia reached for his hand. "Then don't fight alone, let everyone else carry some of the weight too." Daniel nodded. She was right, this wasn't just his battle, it belonged to all of Maplewood. The next day, Daniel called another meeting, this time at the local park instead of his backyard. The crowd was even bigger than before, dozens of families, young and old, all brimming with frustration but also with energy. Some held sparklers in their hands as a sign of protest. Daniel stood on the small wooden stage near the playground and raised his voice. "The board thinks they can silence us. They think they can tell us how to live, what traditions we can celebrate, and what joy we're allowed to have. But this is our community, not theirs. If we stand together, they can't control us." The crowd erupted in cheers. A woman named Karen, who lived 2 streets over, shouted from the front row, "So what do we do? Do we light the fireworks anyway?" The question hung in the air. Everyone wanted to, but everyone also knew the risk: fines, legal trouble, maybe even worse. Daniel hesitated, then said carefully, "We'll have fireworks, but we'll do it smart. We'll make it clear this is a peaceful protest. We'll invite the media if we have to. If the HOA wants to punish us, they'll have to punish all of us, and they'll have to do it in front of the whole city." That idea spread like wildfire. The thought of cameras, reporters, and public attention made people feel safer. If the HOA tried to push them around, at least they wouldn't be able to do it quietly. Over the next week, Maplewood transformed. Residents made secret runs to fireworks stands outside of town, loading up on sparklers, Roman candles, and even a few larger displays. Garages became stockpiles. Teens whispered excitedly about sneaking fireworks in under blankets. Parents, usually the ones telling their kids to be careful, found themselves swept up in the rebellion. It wasn't just about fun anymore, it was about making a point. The HOA, however, wasn't blind to what was happening. Margaret Whitfield could feel the community slipping out of her control. She held an emergency board meeting in the clubhouse, the kind of sterile room with folding chairs and a projector screen that always smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. Margaret stood at the front, her arms crossed tightly. "The residents are planning something. I've heard whispers, I've seen the gatherings. They're going to defy us on the 4th. One of the board members, a nervous man named Howard, cleared his throat. "Should we call the police?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "If it comes to that, yes, but first we remind them who's in charge, send another notice, double the fines, make it $1,000 per incident, and let them know we'll take legal action if necessary. We cannot let them win." The notice arrived the next morning, printed in bold letters and slipped into every mailbox. The effect was immediate. Some residents grew nervous, wondering if the risk was too high. Others grew angrier, convinced now more than ever that the board was overreaching. When Daniel read the notice, his jaw tightened. He gathered his neighbors again that night. "This is exactly why we have to do it," he said, holding up the paper. "If we back down now, they'll think they can bully us forever. We're not children, we're homeowners, we have rights." The crowd cheered, louder than ever before. As July 4th approached, the tension reached its peak. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances in the street. Some decorated their homes with flags and red, white, and blue bunting, daring the board to say something about it. Kids practiced holding sparklers in their driveways. Everyone was waiting, counting down the days, hours, minutes. The night of the 4th finally arrived. The sun dipped below the horizon and the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Families set up folding chairs and blankets on lawns. Grills smoked with hamburgers and hot dogs. Coolers were filled with ice and soda cans. It looked at first like any other holiday, but the atmosphere carried a charge like the air before a thunderstorm. At Daniel's house, his backyard was packed with neighbors. Boxes of fireworks sat hidden under tarps, ready to be revealed. Daniel stood near the grill, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the glow of phones. Neighbors were already streaming live to social media, spreading the word beyond Maplewood. If the HOA wanted to fight, the world would be watching. Then, as the sky darkened fully, the first sparkler was lit. A small flame hissed and a child waved it in the air, drawing glowing circles. The crowd cheered. Soon more sparklers appeared, lighting up driveways and sidewalks. It was a simple act, but it felt like the opening move in their battle. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air. A firecracker shot up into the night sky, exploding into a shower of gold sparks. The crowd erupted into cheers, clapping, and shouting. Another firework followed and another until the night was alive with color. From the other side of the neighborhood, Margaret Whitfield stood on her porch, watching in horror. Her phone buzzed with calls from fellow board members. She dialed the police, her voice trembling with anger. "They're violating the ban. I want officers here immediately." But by the time the first police cars pulled into Maplewood, the scene was impossible to ignore. Dozens of families were gathered on lawns, fireworks bursting overhead, children laughing, parents clapping. News vans had already arrived, cameras rolling. Reporters shouted questions as the sky lit up in red, white, and blue. The officers stepped out of their cars and looked around uncertainly. They weren't seeing a riot or chaos, they were seeing a celebration. One officer muttered, "You've got to be kidding me," as another shook his head. Margaret stormed up to the nearest officer. "Do something, they're breaking the rules." The officer glanced at Daniel, who was standing with his neighbors, holding his son on his shoulders as fireworks exploded overhead. Then he turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, this looks like a community celebration. We're not shutting this down unless someone's in danger." Margaret's face turned red, but the HOA banned it. The officer shrugged. "The HOA isn't the law, ma'am." The crowd roared in approval, the sound almost drowning out the next explosion of color in the sky. For the first time, Maplewood felt like it belonged to its residents again, not to the board. But Margaret wasn't finished. As the fireworks continued, she pulled out her phone and started filming, muttering to herself, "If they want to fight, they'll get one. This isn't over." And somewhere deep down, Daniel knew she was right. The battle wasn't finished, it had only just begun. The fireworks display went on for nearly an hour, lighting up the Maplewood sky in bursts of gold, red, and blue. Children shrieked with delight, neighbors clapped and laughed, and Daniel felt a deep surge of pride as he stood among his friends and family. It was more than a celebration, it was proof that their community was stronger than the HOA's rules. But when the smoke cleared and the last spark fizzled out, the reality of what they had done began to sink in. The HOA had threatened fines and legal action. Margaret Whitfield had stormed off, red-faced and furious, her phone glued to her ear. Daniel knew she wasn't about to let this go quietly. The next morning, envelopes appeared on doorsteps. Inside each one was a violation notice from the HOA, listing a fine of $1,000. Some households received multiple notices, with Margaret claiming that each firework set off counted as a separate incident. The letters were cold and official, citing reckless disregard for community rules. Outrage spread like wildfire. Residents marched across lawns, waving their letters in the air. Conversations turned into heated arguments, voices rising above the hum of lawnmowers and barking dogs. "This is insane," shouted Mr. Patel, holding up his notice. "I didn't even set off fireworks, all I did was sit in my driveway and watch, and they still fine me." "They fined me twice," Karen fumed. "Once for hosting an illegal gathering and once for disorderly conduct. It's like they're making it up as they go." Daniel stood in the center of the crowd, reading his own notice. His fine totaled $3,000. His stomach churned, but his anger burned hotter than his fear. "They can't do this," he said firmly. "These rules were never voted on, they don't have the authority." The residents erupted in agreement, demanding answers, demanding action. Someone suggested refusing to pay, another shouted about filing a lawsuit. The energy was raw, urgent, and restless. That night, Daniel sat at his computer, researching everything he could about HOA law. Sophia sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. Article after article confirmed what he suspected. HOAs had power, yes, but it wasn't unlimited. They couldn't impose arbitrary rules without due process, and they certainly couldn't fine people for acts that weren't explicitly and legally prohibited in the bylaws. The next day, Daniel called a lawyer. His name was James Coleman, a local attorney who had handled HOA disputes before. Sitting in Coleman's office, Daniel laid out the entire story: the fireworks ban, the petition, the refusal, the fines. Coleman listened intently, scribbling notes. Finally, Coleman leaned back in his chair and said, "They've overstepped. From what you've told me, this ban was passed without proper procedure. And these fines, completely unenforceable. If you're willing to fight, I think you've got a strong case." Daniel felt a wave of relief. I'm not just willing, the whole neighborhood is behind me. Coleman smiled, good, because we're going to need every voice we can get. Within days, Daniel and Coleman organized a legal challenge. They drafted letters citing specific laws and precedents. They demanded that the HOA rescind the fines and lift the fireworks ban or face a lawsuit representing the entire community. Daniel distributed copies of the letter to every household, encouraging residents to sign on as plaintiffs. Nearly everyone did. The HOA board, however, dug in their heels. Margaret, furious at the defiance, sent out another notice declaring that unpaid fines would result in liens on homes. The threat sent shivers through the neighborhood. For many, their homes were their biggest investment, their safe haven. The thought of losing them was terrifying. At another neighborhood meeting, the fear was palpable. Parents clutched their notices, their voices shaking. "What if they actually put a lien on our house?" one woman asked. "What if we lose everything?" Daniel stood tall, his voice steady. "They're bluffing. They can't put liens on homes for fines that aren't legal. That's why we're fighting this in court. We have the law on our side. Don't let them scare you." The crowd slowly calmed, reassured by his conviction. For the first time in weeks, Daniel truly felt like a leader, not because he had all the answers, but because he refused to let fear win. The legal battle stretched on for months. There were hearings, filings, tense exchanges of letters between lawyers. Margaret showed up to court dressed in her finest suits, her lips pursed in indignation. She insisted the board had acted in the best interests of the community, citing safety concerns and property values. But Coleman dismantled her arguments piece by piece. He showed that the board had failed to follow procedure, that the community had overwhelmingly opposed the ban, and that the fines had been issued without due process. One by one, the judge struck down Margaret's claims. Finally, after weeks of back and forth, the court issued its decision. The fireworks ban was invalid and all fines were void. The